Okay, guys, we're starting. As I said, I'm very, very, very excited. So please help me just to this little intro. So this is the first game I ever played on my Commodore 64. The name of the game is Attack of the Mutant Camels, made by Llamasoft. It was 1983, and I was 11 years old. And as you can see from the title, you could imagine that it is something totally unconventional. And playing this game probably marked my life forever. And now, after 35 years, I have the pleasure and the honor to host the man who made it, who created it. And he will tell us what's going on during all this time while he's keeping going on making games. And please, a big hand for Mr. Jeff Minter. Thank you. The legendary Yak. The mic to you, Jeff. Thank you so much for coming.
Good morning. I hope you'll forgive me if I'm a little bit nervous. I'm much more used to speaking to machines and sheep than I am to people. I just want to tell you all a little bit about how I ended up spending 36 official years, probably 38 closer in the actual time I've been doing it, working in this industry in which I have no qualifications. When I was at school and afterwards during my time in education, I tried my hardest to avoid doing this. Anyway, let's begin. This was my school in Basingstoke. Basingstoke is a very ordinary town in the UK, and this was a very ordinary school. And it had no computers at all. There was no computing on the curriculum, no coding, no terminals to anywhere. It just didn't exist back in that time. So I had no interest in computers. I had no idea that I might one day be interested in computers. I was just an ordinary kid at school. I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. Then after school, I went to sixth form college. Now, sixth form college is a place where you go for the last 2 years before you go to university, and you do a series of exams that are called your A-levels. This is a college in Basingstoke. This is all just stuff. So typically you take 3 exam subjects, and you take the A-level exams at the end of those, and your results from those will determine whether or not you go to university, and if you do go, what kind of class it's going to be. And these were my subjects. I did maths and physics, which they were the ones that I seem to be sort of, have some kind of aptitude for. Physics more than maths, really, and the intuitive side of physics more than the mathematical side of physics, it must be said. But also English. I loved the English language, I liked English literature. But these were kind of a weird combination of subjects, because back then you had this idea that you were either on the sort of science and engineering side or you were on the creative arts side, and there was like a brick wall between the two sides of it. And you had to be one or the other, and me with this combination of subjects, I was kind of awkwardly straddling this brick wall. And I had no idea where I was going to go, what I was going to do with these subjects. And also at the sixth form college you had a thing called a main study, which makes it sound more important than it is. It actually wasn't a main study at all. It was a study which you did just to fill in the time between your main exam subjects. So it was just a filler subject, really. And they offered me the chance to do a computing main study. And I thought, okay, I'll give it a chance. But this was my idea of what I thought computing was at the time. People in suits, in offices, tending to these big machines which would send you your gas bill. And there was nothing interesting in these machines to me at all. I actually thought it would be very boring. But I thought, I'll take this thing. It's not important. It's not an exam subject. And it's skivable. Now, skiving is the noble art of bunking off out of school and going off to do something else instead. So I thought, this is a subject I can completely miss. I went to one lesson in this main study, and they started to teach us this language called Cecil. Now, this is what it stood for, Computer Education in Schools Instructional Language. Now, it actually wasn't that bad of a language. Now I look back with a bit of knowledge, I can see what it was. It was kind of a bit like kind of a simplified version of some kind of assembler, really. However, it suffered from an absolutely terrible user interface. The UI to Cecil looked like this. And you literally had to write down your code on a piece of paper like that, and then they would gather up the pieces of paper at the end of the class. They would send them off to some place, God knows where, in the post. And then a week later, you would get back your syntax error message. So it wasn't exactly interactive, and it wasn't exactly riveting. So it did nothing to fire my interest up in this stuff at all. So I said bollocks to that, and carried on skiving, which was much more interesting, because outside of college, you go to Woolworths and play about with the Pong machines. You go to the chip shop, have a game of Breakout. You go to the record shop. The record shop was the best because in there they had a Space Invaders. And so I spent hours and hours and hours playing these machines. You must understand, at this point, you had no idea, no concept that this was anything you could do. These machines were just things that people made in the same way that people made televisions or pinball machines or whatever. And as a 16-year-old kid, there was no concept of this being something which you could engage in creatively. And then one day I was in college, and I walked into the wrong room, and I saw a guy sitting in front of one of these things, a guy called, I came to know later on as Ruptured Rawlinson, became one of my best friends at college. And he was playing a game on this thing, and I was like, what? What? How are you playing a game on that thing? And he said, I typed it in. And at that moment, my life changed. The idea that you could type on one of these things and have a game come out was like, how the hell does that work? I have to find out how the hell that works. So that very same day, I went to the school library and I got out a book on BASIC. It wasn't on Commodore BASIC or anything, it was just a generic BASIC book. My brother had one of these, it's a TI-59, I think it was. He was working at a company at the time where he had one of these on loan and he brought it home in the evenings. And it had a little book of programs which came with it. So I didn't know TI-59 calculator language, I didn't really know BASIC. But I looked at one of these programs and I roughly tried to teach myself enough BASIC that I could go into college early the next day. Typed it into the pet. It didn't work, because of course I'd made loads of errors. But luckily, Ruptured Rawlinson came in and found me on the machine trying to get this thing to work, and being a decent lad, he started to help me out, and so with his help, we got my first ever BASIC program running. And at that point, this became my shrine. This was where I worshipped every day. Early mornings and late evenings. Now you must understand, I was a kid who did not like going to school. And my parents thought I was ill or something, because suddenly I was getting up in the morning, I was going to school as early as possible, I was staying in school as late as possible. They could not understand what was going on. And what was going on was I was sat in front of this thing, just learning BASIC. There were in the whole sixth form college, there were like 5 of us who were the geeks, who would spend our time clustered around this machine, and we started writing games for each other eventually when we learnt enough. We were the only nerds in town. Nobody else was interested. Nobody else even knew this thing was there. I mean, it wasn't even being taught on the actual curriculum at the time. It was just there as it was a curiosity. Anyway, we spent time learning the ways of this machine. We didn't have a lot of documentation, so a lot of it was just like hacking about and poking this and poking that, and quite often crashing the machine. We experimented. And we were writing games in BASIC for each other. Actually, at one point, I remember we got in trouble because we started writing down our high scores on the wall of the computing room, and the teachers didn't like that, and we had to paint over them. But that was before you could save high scores to tape or anything. But after I'd been doing BASIC for a couple of months, games in BASIC, BASIC simply wasn't fast enough to do the kind of arcade-style games that I wanted to do. So this guy, Ruptured Rawlinson, who he'd been to a school where they had a computer before, and he knew quite a lot more than I did. He told me there was this thing called machine code, which if you code in that, then it goes way faster than BASIC. And I think he gave me a copy of some 6809 code to look at, and from that I kind of worked out how machine code sort of worked. And then this became my new Bible. One of the computing teachers had a copy of this and he lent it to me over the weekend, and I copied down the opcode list from the back pages, and that was with me all the time. And I'd be sitting there in class, like in my English class, I'd be sitting there, I'd be making notes, and people would be thinking, what a diligent student he is, sitting there making notes. But in fact, the teacher had actually walked around and looked at my notes, he would have seen stuff like that. And the first time I ever got machine code to run, it was like, holy cow. This stuff is orders of magnitude faster than BASIC. I think the first thing I ever did was write, so it was just like poke the whole character set to the screen and then poked it again in inverse video. And I thought, if you didn't think that thing in BASIC, it would sort of go along like this, it would plod along. I expected it to be like maybe 10 times faster in machine code, but in machine code it was just instantaneous. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. I've got to do more of this shit. So yeah, the things that had been slow before were just instant in machine code. And at first I used it to just add extra speed to my basic programs, just to move objects around. But eventually I wanted to write a game that was 100% machine code. I don't know if any of you remember the 8-bit days, but 100% machine code was what they used to put on the package of your game, just to tell people it was properly fast. And actually, yeah, that was probably the last time I used a high-level language for about 16 years. This is actually one of my first ever games. I wrote this when I was 17 years old. This was restored from a 38-year-old cassette tape. And this was the first time I'd seen it running for 38 years. And this is the game restored and actually running in a PET emulator. And in this game, I remember to get sound effects out of it, you would put an AM radio over the cassette deck. And it would pick up, you put the processor into loops of different tightness, and you could actually get different sound effects and pitches that way. So yeah, it was crazy times. But through all this, I discovered that the bridge between these two sides of things, between the creative side and the science and engineering side, was code. It was a revelation to me, and it was just, I'm sure that many of you had the same revelation. You'll hear your coders. I mean, for me, I often say being a coder is like the modern equivalent of being a wizard, because by speaking these words of power, you can speak things into existence. And I think once you get used to the feel of doing that, nothing can replace that. It's the best thing ever. Coding is life. Life is coding. I found my perfect subject. And I just wanted to spend all my time doing that. And I thought, the obvious thing was, let's change one of my exam subjects into this computing, because I was already learning a great deal about it. Pretty soon I knew more than the teachers, at least about machine code and the PET. And so I asked to transfer. I said, I'm obviously into this stuff. I can obviously do this stuff. Let me, bin English or something, and I'll take this up and we'll take it forward to university. They said no. They said, the exam courses have started. They didn't believe I'd be able to catch up, so access denied. I was gutted. I mean, I genuinely wanted to move forward into the educational system doing this stuff. I wasn't allowed to. School life went on. I grudgingly went on with the stuff I was supposed to be doing, the maths, physics and English, but basically all my time was spent on the PET. That was where all my learning effort was going. But there was still time for more skiving. And we used to go to this shop. This was in a day when digital watches was still a pretty neat idea. And we go to this shop where they had Atari VCS, and they had this thing, the television computer system, which I couldn't afford one of those, so I ended up getting one of these. This actually, they did promise that one day there was going to be a module for it which would allow you to code it in hexadecimal. And I want that. I wanted some kind of programmable system in my home, and I couldn't afford a Commodore PET. I think they were about sort of 800 quid at the time, well out of the range of a 16-year-old schoolboy. But we'd hang around in this shop and bother the people in there without ever actually buying anything, the way you do when you're a kid. And there was this thing which I really fancied as well, the Superboard, which was a lot like the Pet, but kind of half the price, but still just way beyond my range as a kid. But then, there was a miracle. I remember watching the TV one evening, and there was this guy demonstrating something called the ZX80, and you could get it for 100 quid. Now, it was still a lot for a 16-year-old kid, but it was within range. You could see your way to doing it. So I took an evening job that I went to after college. I was working in a place in Basingstoke, cleaning the offices and toilets, glamorous stuff, but I was able to order my 1K ZX80 in spring of 1979. And that was the end of my school days. In summer of 79, I got 2 things in the post on the same day. One of them would change my career forever, and it wasn't my exam results. I passed, but I scraped through. I mean, they were pretty rubbish exam results, really. But the other thing I got was that. I loved that thing. I mean, a screen twitch and all, I loved it. And the rest of that summer was spent, I bought a knackered old black and white telly. When the telly was old enough, it still had a 405 line standard on it. It was full of valves and took like 10 minutes to warm up when you turned it on. But it was my display for my computer. I spent every waking moment with that thing. I'm not sure what my parents thought I was doing. I think they thought it was some weird craze I was getting into that wouldn't lead anywhere. Expanded to 4K, 2114 at a time, because that was all I could afford. And I submitted one of my programs to Practical Computing, this magazine that had a section for ZX80 programs, and I wrote a little thing in there and submitted it to them, and actually published it. There it is, my first ever published program. It was just a little like move a cursor around and draw things on the screen touch. But it was my first ever published program. And this is the invoice for the first ever money I received from coding for 5 quid. I was so proud of that. It was excellent. And somebody kindly gave me a copy of that magazine, so I've actually got a copy of it now. And then off I went to university. I went to the University of East Anglia, which wasn't my first choice. I wanted to go to one in Wales, but my grades weren't good enough, so they shoved me off to East Anglia. And I couldn't start on a computing course because I didn't have the A-level in it, so I was forced into like maths and physics. Of course, I spent the entire year messing about on the computers and not studying maths and physics at all. Me and a few friends ended up hacking the sort of mainframe. I think it was a VAX 11780, and they had this like shell which was what the students were supposed to use, and you only allocated a certain amount of time. And we found out that by pressing Control C in the right place, you could break out and get down to a lower level where you could allocate yourself whatever you wanted. We eventually got busted, nearly thrown out. And then I finally did get thrown out because my results were shit because I hadn't actually been studying at all properly. So I asked to transfer to a computing course anyway. No, you can't. So I was desperately trying all the time to get into proper education on the computer. But every time they wouldn't let me in, every time I was gutted. But I was determined that I was going to get to study computing, and my parents really didn't like the fact that I'd been kicked out of university. I was not the most popular son at that point. So I got a place at Oxford Polytechnic. Now, Polytechnic is kind of like university, but a bit more rubbish. It's just not quite as good. But I could get in on the maths and physics course, but they said I'd be able to transfer at the end of a year. Hallelujah, you know. So finally, I started autumn of 1981, and I had a long commute each day by bicycle and train. I was going I think riding 6 miles to a train station, then sort of like a 45-minute train journey and another 2 miles uphill to the Polytechnic, and there and back every day. But meanwhile, Uncle Clive came out with the ZX81. Now the ZX81 was a very significant machine. It was cheaper and better than the ZX80, and it was the first sort of time when computing started to gain interest beyond just nerds. People were actually starting to see that maybe just ordinary people might want to have one of these people in their homes. And And these enthusiasts started to have these things. You have events where you'd all meet up, and it was great. There were these things called the ZX microfairs, where you'd go and you'd see people. It's the first time I'd ever seen people selling software, people selling games. I was like, whoa, that's crazy. You can do that stuff. And I went there as a punter one time and just had to have a few games with me from the ZX81. And I stopped by this one firm who were selling RAM packs, and I showed them some of these games. And they gave me a 16K RAM pack. I couldn't believe it. They said, if you want to develop some game for us, we'll give you this thing that cost about 50 quid at the time. And I asked to develop some games for sale. I thought, well, wow, this is fantastic. You can get paid for making games. Yes, have that. This was the first game where I ever had any moment of fame. I was queuing up to go to another one of these ZX microfairs, and there were some lads in the queue in front of me talking about the games they've been playing. And one of them said, "Yeah, I've been playing DK-tronic Centipede." And I was like, I tapped him on the back. So, "You've been playing DK-tronic Centipede?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "It's really good." I said, "I made that game." He said, "Are you Jeff Minter?" I was like, "He knows my name. Wow. That's crazy." So yeah, there's a little bit of it here. You can see it's pretty. I don't think I'd even played the arcade game of Centipede at this time. It was that's how clueless I was about how this game actually worked. Anyway, a bit of speed through that time. It pauses a bit between videos, give it a chance to catch up. Come on, there we are. But anyway, through doing all this stuff, I was going to Polytechnic, and I was also working with this guy. Hang on, it's frozen. This output does not match this output. Okay, it's caught up now. Sort of. Excuse me, there's a technical error. This is displaying one thing, and this is displaying another thing. No. Okay, now this is displaying one thing and that's displaying another thing. I'll try and get these two things to synchronize. So basically I was working at Polytechnic and I was also doing stuff on the ZX81 every night and travelling to Great Yarmouth on weekends, and it was just too much really. I ended up making myself quite seriously ill. I don't know how this is out of sync. Perhaps I'll unplug it and plug it back in again. Excuse me a second. This has gone funny. Try again. It should catch up again now, I hope. Okay, there we are. And I also found out that these guys had been ripping off my stuff. This was the advert of the cousin of the guy who had lent me the RAM pack, and he was selling these things which I'd made for. I wasn't getting any money for them, so I found out I was getting ripped off by the people who were selling my games at the time. So it wasn't a particularly good time for me. There I was out of higher education again, still not studying computing. The guys publishing my ZX81 stuff were crooks. I had made myself ill. However, I got one of these. While I was recovering from my illness, I got one of those so much nicer than the ZX81. Programming was something I could do lying down. I bought some software for it, and it was awful. They were charging like £7 for rubbish games, and I had an epiphany at this point. I started doodling in a character editor. I doodled this little thing, Llamasoft. I thought, why don't we do this stuff ourselves? I mean, my games may be crap, but they're not as crap as some of the other stuff that people are selling for £7, so let's have a go. And I wouldn't have to deal with dodgy geezers in Great Yarmouth. And I had nothing to lose, I was at rock bottom at that point, so I started Llamasoft March 1982. Few little games on the VIC-20 originally, sold through small text ads and computer mags, and that was our fantastic packaging look. And this was quite a crappy Defender clone I did. Look at that chunky scrolling and a ship the size of a bus. We exhibited at the Commodore show in Hammersmith. Amazingly enough, we sold out of tapes. A nice gentleman in a suit came around and asked me if I could make a cartridge version for the US market. I said yes, although I had no idea how. Eventually, I did get it into ROM and made this game Aggressor, which was all right. But this was the era of clones. Everybody was making Defender or arcade. You expected to make arcade games really, and then Atari started getting heavy about it, and they put out a warning they're going to stomp all the people making clones. So of course, I changed Defender to Andy's Attack by just turning the humanoids into llamas, which of course made it a completely different thing. And I wanted a centipede-style game, but again, I was mindful of Atari, so I thought I'll change the theme, and I made this sort of space-themed centipede-style game, and I actually liked it better than the original Centipede. It was done in a week, start to finish, hand-assembled in hex, and I started to have my own design elements, and I actually found that more satisfying than just doing clones. And the US guys seemed to really like it. Meanwhile, Uncle Clive once again came out with an ace, with the Specky. Everybody loved Uncle Clive. You must understand he was a hero to British schoolboys at that time. His work kick-started the UK software biz, really, and even the Queen loved him. In September 1982, I was given one of these. The US guys brought over this strange new machine, which looked like the VIC-20, but was a bit more powerful. Some months earlier, I'd seen this game on the Atari VCS, and I saw a review of this game. I played it, it was okay, but that's all I really thought of it. Then a reviewer mentioned that it had giant mechanical camels. I always loved camels for some reason, and so I thought, why not do a version with giant ordinary camels? And that's where Attack of the Mutant Camels came out. It was somewhat clunky, you'll see about this later on. You'll hear how terrible the code was in this later on. There's another talk about it. I'm dreading that because they're going to tear my code apart and tell me how awful I am. But it was distinctive. But I love camels, and I wanted them to be the heroes, so I made a sequel where the camels escape their oppressors and they fight back against the Xiaxian Empire, and so this was Revenge of the Mutant Camels, which quite a few people remember on the Commodore 64, and 42 levels, which was a lot at the time, and it wasn't a clone of anything. I was enjoying much more freedom, not just doing arcade games, but doing my own stuff. Stuff like Hover Bobber, a game about mowing the lawn. This was a favourite of mine because it was designed by me and my dad together. Sheep in Space, and yeah, we finally got decent artwork instead of that crappy stuff we'd had before. And these were the 8-bit days. They were fun, they were experimental. These were just fantastic times, and breaking free of that compulsion to do arcade games was one of the best things ever, really. But anyway, I can't really go on and... Iridis Alpha, yeah, this was towards the end of my Commodore career. You had so much creative freedom in those days. It was fantastic. Really, really a very enjoyable time to be working in the games industry. I'm not going to try and cover everything I make because we'll be here all day, because I think Llamasoft's done about 100 things. So people tend to think of me as primarily a Commodore or Atari coder, that Tempest guy. But I did not make Tempest. The original Tempest was made by Dave Toira. I just want to make that clear so nobody thinks that, even though there is a kind of Minotaur artwork, it's not actually my original creation. I did make these. And we also made these. TXK is clearly not completely Tempest, despite what Atari may say. And Space Giraffe looks a bit like Tempest, but really isn't at all like Tempest. And some people think Llamasoft only makes Tempest games. I'm the Tempest guy, but no, those are our Tempest-related games. I've made nearly 100 games in Light since, so probably 5% of our output is actually Tempest. But I think I've had enough Tempest now. Tempest is done. It's over. Somebody else can have it. Now, back in the day, Britain had system wars going on even back then. You had your sensible, proper Commodore people, Commodore enthusiasts, and then you had your daft, deluded Specky boys who thought the Spectrum was better. But we knew in our heart of hearts that the Commodore was better. But I'm known as a Commodore loyalist, but there's a terrible confession I have to make today. I'm actually more of a Specky boy than almost anybody on the planet, apart from him. And the reason is, nobody has coded more Sinclair Descended machines than me. ZX80, yes, you know about ZX81, I told you about my first successful game. I did a few things on the Specky, but not much. At that time, primarily, I was on the Commodore, but there was a Super Spectrum in development, which was never released, called Loki. But some of the guys who worked on Loki, these engineers, left and created a company called Flare 1. And the Flare 1, or called Flare, their machine was called the Flare 1. It was never released in that form, but it evolved into the Connex multi-system, which I did code on. I think this video actually works. It was never released. I seem to have had this habit on coding on machines that were never released. And then they went on to develop the Atari Panther, which I also coded on. And then they went on to develop this thing, the Flare 2, which you may know by a different name, and I coded on that as well. Matheson worked at Atari. They developed Jaguar 2, which I would have coded on if they'd only survived a little bit longer. And then they left and formed a company called VM Labs, and I joined them, and we made the Nuon. So these are all machines with a direct lineage back through Sinclair. So yes, I guess that must be a specky boy after all. Now Nuon, I just want to basically touch briefly on the Nuon. Nuon is a machine which is quite often maligned. People they think, all they hear about it is Nuon was a flop, Nuon was a failure, only had 11 games, and most of them were awful. But it was actually a really pretty cool machine. It was conceived as a cheap alternative to hardware MPEG decode for DVDs, which were just emerging at the time. And they thought if they could make a general purpose CPU fast enough to run the decoding software, then you could also code it to do all kinds of other stuff, do games, do special effects for DVDs, do all kinds of stuff, for the same price as a hardware MPEG decoder. So it was a good idea. And it was an interesting machine because it encompassed both coarse and fine-grained parallelism. You had these MPEs, these were called Merlin processor elements, and you had 4 of them in an array in the first chip. The plan was that in later versions of the chip, you just have larger and larger arrays of these things. And these MPEs, it was what was called a VLIW processor, or variable length VLIW CPU, each one of those was. The idea being you had these discrete function units on each CPU, and you could write code to actually place instructions on all of these function units explicitly. So what you'd try and do, if you're trying to write an inner loop, you would try and make sure that every single instruction slot in each instruction was entirely filled. You wanted a fat packet filled with all the possible instructions. And you could spend, like 2 days or a week working on one inner loop, working it down from 10 instructions to 8 instructions. And as an assembler nerd, this stuff was just bread and butter to me. I absolutely loved it. The assembler you used was called Low-Level Assembler for Merlin Architecture, and there was a plan to have a simplified assembler which would do all the instruction packing for you, called the Abstract Level Packing Assembler. If you look at the acronyms for those, you may kind of work out some who might have been involved with some of this stuff. And each MPE had a register file that could be addressed in various ways. You could address it as vectors, as scalars, or as pixels, or as what they called small vectors that were like less accurate vectors. And a lot of the instructions could work on entire vectors, and they came with like shifts built in. It wasn't bad. I only considered this was a 54 megahertz CPU with no GPU, and we were able to run games like this. This is a Tempest. What you'd have to do is break the screen up into little chunks and work on one chunk at a time. And like, for example, it's actually quite tricky code. Imagine these like fat line drawing routine. You'd have to work out which lines were traversing your fragment, and then work out how far each pixel was from the pure line. Actually, the task of writing that line draw was originally given to this guy from Sega inside VM Labs, and after he'd worked on it for a couple of weeks, he just said, "No, I can't do this." He said, "Jeff, you do it." And it was very, very tricky, especially because the MPEs, each one only had 4K bytes of instruction RAM and 4K bytes of data RAM. And so you had to have like an overlay manager on each MPE, which would DMA in whatever bit of code you needed into that instruction RAM, and then DMA in a bit of screen RAM, and you try and work as much as you could on that chunk as you could before you blast it back out again. So it was quite a dance getting this thing to work. And in the end, they actually had to extend 2 of the MPEs. They had to extend MPE3, whose duty was to do audio, by giving it more instruction and data RAM and giving it a cache so it could access external RAM without having to do the DMAs by hand. They did the same thing on MPE0, because people basically just wanted to run the C code. Originally, the plan was for all these things to be identical, but people wanted to be able to run C code. People already were falling out of love with assembler, and it breaks my heart. And this was the first occasion of my coming back to a high-level language, was writing C on MPE0. My game code, when I originally started writing my game, I'd had 3.5 MPEs to do the rendering, and by the time it came out, I was cut down to about 1.5, and the game logic in C on MPE0, and so the game ran at a lower resolution and at a lower frame rate than I'd have liked. But the whole idea was, given that this was going to be a scalable array of MPEs, if they have ever had actually released the version with more MPEs, the code would have scaled up automatically and immediately run faster and at a higher res. So it was a cheap 54 megahertz chip with no hardware assist, and yet you could do shader-like stuff, per pixel operations, and run your game logic, and do all your audio synthesis in real time. Yeah, it was pretty damn cool. People remember its failure, but I remember it as being really quite an amazing little chip. Anyway, it was late to market, unfortunately, about a year late coming out. The uptake by manufacturer was limited, and games people at that point, they were just writing C and use libraries, and they had the PlayStation 1. It was a billion times easier to write code for PlayStation 1 than Nuon, so it was never really taken up. But I don't regret my time working on it. It was too weird and gnarly, but I really enjoyed it. I learnt a lot by coding on it. People think like we always work on failing systems, but really we just like interesting new prototype systems. We love working on new stuff. And yeah, I can code anything. Anyway, Ivan Zorzin joined us in 2003, or joined me in 2003. I say us, that's a bit pretentious. But he loves coding interesting systems. He's very good at low-level coding as well. We got on very well together, and he made the basis of the Neon music visualizer for the prototype Xbox 360. Which I'm sure you've probably seen if you've seen the Xbox. And he developed and maintains what we call the Neon engine, which he'll be given a talk about later on. This allows for us to do cross-platform development tailored to our particular style. And you'll hear Ivan talk about this afternoon. We're currently working on PSVR, which we've been working on since since before it first came out. Again, we love to play with prototypes. And I did a game called Minotaur Rescue just in a month to teach myself the fundamentals of VR. I didn't use a controller, you control the ship by looking with your head. Did TXK in VR, ported to PSVR and Oculus DK2, but not released because of certain things with Atari. And then we did Polybius last year, which has been very well received. And it was even using the 9 Inch Nails music video called Less Than. And our release this year is Tempest 4000, when Atari eventually get around to releasing it. It's pretty much finished. And it's been quite a journey from this to that. I always say it seems like, when I first got into the business, it was like driving an ox cart, and now it's like flying the Starship Enterprise, and we've covered everything in between. But it's been a fantastically interesting journey, and it's not over yet. Still very much enjoying the journey, still loving the code. And my life has been an endless chain of projects. I'm sure it will always be an endless chain of projects. Never got rich. Sometimes I've been quite poor, but I live in a lovely place, doing work I genuinely enjoy, and I've never worked on anything I didn't love, and I think that's a big privilege. Thank you. That's Llamasoft so far. I've just made it under the wire. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.